Kia ora koutou, ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Welcome and thank you to everyone who's turned up here to what we are all very much looking forward to and trying to get our head around the New Zealand climate standards. I am Darren, I am part of the WOW Trust and very happy and excited to be here for our 5th year. We're a small but ever growing charity, a bunch of very motivated volunteers giving up a lot of time to try to do many events during the year, but obviously the WOW Summit is our pinnacle, and it's as we talk about, it's every year the regular time to for people to come in and just get a fresh shot in the arm to talk about sustainability in our area. Before I introduce our speaker, just a little bit of admin. Emergency exits, you can see emergency exit out here. If there is an emergency, we'll meet over at the Masonic Lodge, which is that white lodge over there. If we can make sure that all our phones are turned off so that we have no interruptions. Also, this event is online, so what our plan of attack is there'll be some parts through the conversation where there'll be time for Q&A. If you do want to say and ask a question, you can put your hand up. We're going to use put your hand up, or you can use Minty. But if you do want to say something, can you just make sure that you talk into the microphone, because so all the people online can hear what your question is. So today, as I said, we're talking about climate-related disclosures. I think there's probably a lot of people probably don't necessarily understand it. That's why we're here today. And there's probably a lot of skeptical people out there of going, what is the actual impact going to be of just getting the big companies to starting to disclose more information? I have a couple of friends who are quite senior in some of the banks up in Auckland, and it is actually starting to become real. So when I talk to them, they are looking at basically carbon per, number of carbon of units per loan book. So they have started identifying some of their high climate or carbon outputters and started actually progressively, proactively going to those clients and saying, hey, in 10 years, you may struggle to get the lending that you want because you are pulling down our average, and we're going to have targets to decrease this average. So they are progressively and proactively actually going out to these high carbon outputters and saying, okay, if you've got a green initiative, if you've got something that you can show that is going to decrease, this will help you getting lending in the future, but also some of them are getting actual better lending rates. So I think that it is already starting to happen, so it's not just a tick in the box coming out of XRB and out of the government. So super lucky to introduce Jackie. So Jackie is the classic, we're very super lucky in Wanaka. We seem to have a whole lot of sustainability professionals, a whole lot of professionals that are in our area here. So Jackie is on many boards, comes out of Deloitte, and is actual chair of the steering committee for XRB, which is the organisation that looks after all this reporting. So I will zip it and pass it over to Jackie. Thanks, Jackie.
Thank you. Tēnā koutou katoa. This is on, I assume. Well, look, welcome to this summit and welcome to the session today. As we said, I'm Jacqueline Cheyne. I am leading the project steering committee for the development of these standards, which has been an absolute privilege, I will say. And can I ask, before we sort of get into the session, who here had heard about the Aotearoa climate reporting standards before this? Okay, that's great. It kind of gives me a little bit of a sense as to how to pitch it, and the related, the TCFD that these standards are based on. Who was aware of the TCFD? Cool. Okay, thank you. So it has been quite a daunting task. We've been at it for about 18 months to 2 years from setting up the project at the XRB. We've recruited some amazing people. We have Dr. Amelia Sharman, who is leading the group. We have Dr. Stephen Gray as well, working on the scenario analysis piece. Judy Ryan helping us with the greenhouse gas emissions. And we've just assembled such a fantastic team, and we've had great feedback from our constituents and our stakeholders about all of the outreach that the team has done, getting the feedback, making adjustments as we've been going along to try and take account of people's feedback, because this is going to be quite a significant change for a number of companies in terms of implementing these standards. There are some pretty hefty penalties for directors and companies, including imprisonment and things like $5 million fines, if you're not complying with the law or complying with the standards. So this is a pretty big deal, to be honest. Look, I assume that many of you here will be well aware of some of the systemic risks and the significance of what we're facing in terms of climate risk. And that, of course, is a risk that's going to affect society and within society, us as individuals, but also businesses. And that's just a quote there from Sanford, thinking about that quote there about 1.1 trillion a year, not just generally, and low carbon investments being required. And then thinking about the consequences of differences and changes in temperature. Now this just shows some highlights of the differences between 1.5 and 2 degrees. Many of you will know or will have seen what's just come out of the UN that says we're just nowhere near on track for 1.5. We're actually closer to getting up to 2.5, 2.7. Now the implications of that are not going to be linear. The implications of that, so where we see 2.6 degrees worse from 1.5 to 2, 2 to 2.5 or higher than that is not necessarily going to be linear, because we just don't understand sufficiently what the implications will be. So there are significant implications for business, both in terms of the physical risks that may manifest, in terms of their assets and potential damage to their asset base, but also in terms of the transition. And things like changes in regulation, phasing out of particular ICE vehicles or phasing out of coal, phasing out of oil and gas, the changes in the carbon price, consumer demands. I'm on the board of a listed property company. We're thinking really hard about the Green Star ratings because our tenants, and particularly our big tenants, they want buildings with good Green Star ratings. So customers are demanding change. Investors are well aware that these changes are going to drive potential changes in the investment proposition of the businesses that they are lending to or that they are investing in. So in terms of why report on climate change and its impacts? Well, investors are asking for this information. They want the information to be able to make good decisions about where they're putting their money, our money, through KiwiSavers. But also, thinking about climate risk and opportunity in a formal sense actually helps the companies themselves think about what is coming at them down the line, what actually, potentially, what do they need to do to change their business model, take advantage of opportunities, because it's not just all downside. There's a huge amount of opportunities, thinking about different technology and different solutions to the climate crisis. Just going to come back to those. So companies have already voluntarily been providing a lot of this information through things like the CDP, which is the Carbon Disclosure Project, because investors have been asking for it anyway. And internationally, I'll just start with the 2017. So the Financial Stability Board, it's an international organization that's membership-based that looks at risks to the global financial system. So they came out with guidance for disclosing climate risks and opportunities. And that is kind of quite bedded in and become quite accepted. There's a lot of companies across the world that are disclosing in accordance with the TCFD or the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So they do a report every year that looks at the progress that's being made and the quality of the disclosures that have been made under that regime, bearing in mind that it's entirely voluntary. Now, those that are not voluntary, so the EU had a directive in 2014. It's a bit broader. It's on sort of more broader sustainability concepts and applied to quite a small, I think it was sort of like 5,000 of the largest companies in the EU. I'm not entirely sure of that fact. I'm not aware that we're live streaming. But it was a relatively small proportion of the largest companies in the EU. That was expanded in 2021, so just last year, with the EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And again, it is much broader than climate risk. It includes climate risk, but it's also sustainability in a broader sense. And that will be coming in progressively over the next few years. It has mandatory assurance requirements across the whole thing, not just greenhouse gas emissions. And that applies to a much larger number of companies in the EU. So the SEC has also come up with its proposals this year for climate-related disclosures. And this year, so there's a new organization that's been formed, which is the International Sustainability Standards Board. That's kind of like where there's always been an International Financial Reporting Standards Board, and this has sort of come out of that, and it's looking to sort of develop something that will cut across the world. What's quite interesting about these, well, I think one is this is happening globally. The requirements are happening globally. So people who say that New Zealand is getting out ahead of the game and it's all just too much, well, that's not quite true. We might be one of the first in the world to make it mandatory, but it is happening, and it is happening elsewhere. There is quite a bit of a difference between the way the European Union is approaching this to the way that the SEC and the ISSB and the TCFD are approaching it. So the EU is taking very much an ESG sort of approach in terms of impacts on the environment as well as impacts on the entity, whereas the SEC and the ISSB are taking a much more of a corporate approach, capital markets approach. This is about information for investors. So there's a bit of a divergence happening there, which I'm not sure whether it will continue to diverge or whether it will come back together at some point. So in New Zealand in 2021, I always love the names they give these acts, it became mandatory for climate reporting entities, and we'll define those in a second, to produce climate statements that will be publicly available. They have to put them on a register in accordance with the standards that the XRB is developing. So who will this apply to? So this applies to large listed equity and debt issuers with market cap exceeding 60 million. So one of the companies I'm on the board of, Stride, will have to comply. The other one, Pesos, a little tech company, they won't at this stage. And large financial organizations, banks, and fund managers with assets greater than 1 billion. So this picks up, like, if your KiwiSaver scheme and your banks and your insurance companies. We're on track to issue the standard in December this year. We've had all of the final feedback, and our team is just working on making those final amendments based on that feedback. And the regime kicks in once we've issued the standard. So if we issue the standard in September, and your financial year starts on the 1st of January, then you'll be reporting for the first time December 23. So it's not far away. So Stride will be reporting March 24. So I'll just pause there. Does anybody have any questions just about I'm going to get onto the detail of what's required in the standard, but in terms of the basis of the regime, I will point out that there has been a little bit of tension, or tension's maybe not the right word, but this picks up listed companies. It doesn't pick up private companies. So, no, it's got a. Yeah, you do.
Thank you. Just thinking about that number with a non-super financial brand, what kind of major companies, well-known companies in New Zealand can we expect to see reports coming from in the next couple of years?
So there'll be Air New Zealand, Auckland Airport, Fisher & Paykel, banks, Westpac, ASB. Yeah, pretty much anything that's in the NZX 50. It's most of them. I don't know the exact off the top of my mind. Mercury, Meridian, Contact, Genesis.
Hi, Jackie. How are you?
Okay.
I just wonder if you could comment on the extent to which you mentioned, so the European developments like wider ESG and stuff, the extent to which the New Zealand regime will take in some of reporting around those wider risks. So if companies go on the journey, then will they encounter these other kinds of issues,
sure.
Sustainability issues?
Look, with some of the risks and opportunities around climate change are overlapping with other types of risks, so some of it might get picked up in that. And the scenario analysis that we'll talk about a bit later on can get quite involved in terms of looking at different possible futures and what will actually happen in terms of socioeconomic changes, for example. There's another, the legislation also empowers the XRB to issue voluntary standards around ESG-related matters, and we have another project that we're working on, and we're actually coming at it from a Māori worldview lens to think about what's actually going to work best in terms of reporting intergenerational impacts. And so that's a different project that is, it's pretty special, actually. It's a little bit daunting, but we're not just sort of picking up the Global Reporting Initiative or the Integrated Reporting Framework. We're actually thinking about how will this actually work best from a New Zealand point of view, and we're working in the Māori area as a pilot on that particular framework. Companies are asked for that information from investors regularly, maybe not quite so much as some of the climate-related information, so they will provide it. And then there's other legislation coming in, like potentially the modern slavery legislation as well, that's going to provide. So there's a lot happening, people talking about task force for nature. So it's not necessarily right in this, but there's a lot of movement towards it.
Thank you. Just out of the interest, if we're talking about the large international companies who have small subsidiaries operating here in New Zealand, how this legislation affects them?
Oh, that's a really technical question. So, that is actually quite a technical question. There's a number of companies that are currently applying for an exemption from the FMA because they have large, overseas bodies that are reporting. So I can't specifically answer that because it's a little bit out of my technical expert. Yeah, it's a legal question. Yeah. There's a lot of information in the Act on it.
I've really got two questions, which is cheating. First of all, does this cover people like the charities like Sanitarium and the government areas like the ACC investments and the retirement funds?
So strictly under the legislation, ACC and the super fund don't fall into these, but the government has given them a direction that they need to comply. So the New Zealand Super Fund and ACC do have to comply. Likes of Sanitarium, probably not. If they don't have issued debt or equity, then they probably don't. But again, there's some. We're still working through how the Act kind of filters down through.
And the other question's kind of related to that. Do you expect these thresholds to be pushed downwards over the years?
It's probably more than just the thresholds. It's actually probably a widening of the regime to incorporate private companies, or maybe and MB is doing some work on that, because there's also the question of the public sector and how should the public sector report, and the International Public Sector Financial Reporting Standards Board is thinking about embarking on a project about how should the public sector report against this. So it could get a lot broader, and MB is doing some work around what that might look like. Cool. I need to be careful of time. You need to keep me on track. Okay, so what are the standards? So we've got 3 standards. The one in the middle is really it's a first-time adoption one. It sort of gives you some relief, so you don't have to do it all in one go. But we've only given people relief really for about, I think, 1 year, apart from some comparative information which will come in over time. NZCS3 sort of provides the overarching principles. It's really important to read it because it does sort of talk about things like fair presentation, completeness, free of bias. How do you think about what might be important? Because you could write a massive report on this sort of stuff, and then readers are just going to get lost in the detail. So you do need to think about what's material and how to communicate. And it also has requirements for clearly disclosing things like assumptions and methodologies, because if you don't disclose how you have calculated some of this stuff, again, you're not going to be able to compare one company with another or figure out what's good and what's bad. So we're looking for a lot of transparency from that sort of principles based. And CS1 will go through, so it's really the meat of what it is that you need to disclose. So there are 4 key sections, and these are based on the TCFD. So if you're familiar with the TCFD, you'll be familiar with this framework. And we've stuck reasonably closely to the TCFD, although we have been keeping an eye on that ISSB set of standards, and we have incorporated some of their stuff into ours, because we want to stay as aligned internationally as we can, but they're still at the consultation phase, so it's a moving feast. It's challenging. So the governance section, that just says, look, please just tell us how you think about this as a company. How does your board get involved? How does management think about this? What sort of systems have you got for reporting? Who's responsible, and where do they sit in the organisation? So it should give you a flavour for how important does the organisation think about this. Do you look at your risk every year, every 5 years, once a quarter? How often are you reporting your metrics to the board? It's kind of just trying to get a sense of, do you care about this at the highest level of the organisation? All of this is on the XRB website in terms of the draft standards and things, so I'm not going to go through the detail in here. So the draft standards are on the website, and there's staff guidance as well that is this sort of goes into, well, here's some ideas about how you might want to think about these disclosures. So the strategy section is the media section. It's the most challenging part of the standard. And what it's really doing is it's saying, tell us about what are your risks and opportunities, what are the impacts of climate change on your business, and how is it impacting on you today? How might it impact you in the future? And what are you going to do about that? What is your transition plan? What are your strategies? How are you going to change your strategies, if at all? Right? So it asks for disclosure on climate risks and opportunities, and it asks for that disclosure both in terms of the physical risks and the transition risks. So it's saying, tell us about what your risks are in the transition. Things like changes in regulation, changes in carbon price, changes in technology. Now, this isn't easy. I've been trying to do this on a couple of organizations. It's like, well, what do you mean? Do you mean today? Do you mean in 10 years' time? Like, what do you mean? Right? And there is we'll come to the risk management section later. And the physical risks and opportunities. So we're doing a climate risk assessment of every single one of our buildings at Stride to see how resilient they are, and look at things like have they got a gas boiler, and all of that type of stuff. How are we going to transition those assets over time? So I mentioned, when might these risks eventuate? So it does ask for organizations to say, what are the time periods over which you think these risks are going to appear? Define those time periods in terms of short, medium, and long term. And then tell us current impacts. So there's been it's one thing to say, well, this is what's currently impacting us from climate change. We've changed our vehicle fleet to EVs from ICE vehicles, or we're going to do some research on this, or we're doing Green Star rating. These are things we're actually doing right now. It also asks for the financial impacts, the current financial impacts. Now that's a bit trickier, and what it also says is, look, if you really can't do that, then just tell us you can't do it and tell us why you can't do it. Now, it's not meant to be a total get out of jail free clause, but some of it is actually quite difficult to attribute as well. So, you might get some flood damage. Well, how do you know how much of that extra rain related to climate change? Insurance company might be able to do that because they've got people who crunch that kind of numbers all the time, and they might be able to say this much was attributable to climate change because it's different to a normal year. But we're dealing with companies here who don't have a lot of staff, don't have the expertise. So that's why we've put in if you're unable to, then just say that you can't. And why. I'm going to come back to this. So then we're asking for disclosure on, well, what do you think is going to impact you in future? What are the anticipated impacts? And these are reasonably expected. This is not every potential impact. And again, this is difficult. This is hard. What are the anticipated impacts of the climate risks and opportunities? And then the anticipated financial impacts. And again, you've got that get out. If this is really, you can't do the financial, then you don't, just tell us why you can't do the financial impacts. And we expect that the sophistication of this disclosure will improve over time. So, we fully expect in the first few years of this that people will be trying, but they will get better as time goes on. But one of the tools that organizations use or commonly use to think about the anticipated impacts and also risks and opportunities is scenario analysis. So there is a presumption in writing the standard that organizations will be using scenario analysis to think about the risks and opportunities and the resilience of their strategy and the potential impacts in the future, and how that will affect their strategy. So there's a kind of underlying presumption there, and we're asking people to disclose or describe the scenario analysis that they've undertaken, and we're asking them to tell us about as part of that, we're asking for a 1.5 degree scenario, a greater than 3 degrees, so a hothouse world scenario, and then a third one. Now, this was the proposal that was in the exposure draft. We originally had 2, and then we went to 3, and we've had some feedback that 3 is too much, so we're still debating whether or not it should be 2 or 3. Now, this can be quite a resource-intensive exercise. The scenario analysis is not a forecast. It's not a one-point thing. It's not, we think this is going to happen. It's about looking at what we call plausible futures. What might the future look like in a 1.5 degree world, in a 3 degree world, and this other world? How might we get there? So this is the other thing. If you've got a 1.5 degree scenario that you have used, yours might be different to somebody else's. Because you might think, oh, well, this is how we're going to get to 1.5. That might be different to what another company thinks is how we're going to get to 1.5. There are different ways of getting there. So and those different ways lead to different impacts on a company's strategy, right? So the standard asks the company to be quite transparent about describing that scenario analysis and telling us what the assumptions are that they have based their future analysis on. Now, because this is difficult and it's time-consuming and resource-intensive, we have suggested, right, we can't require this, we have suggested that sectors get together and do this together in a facilitated way. And this slide's a little bit old, it's probably about 6 months old, but the marine sector did this with the Aotearoa Circle over a year ago. So on the Aotearoa Circle's website, you can find the marine sector's scenario analysis and how they think it will affect New Zealand's marine sector. Insurance have quite well progressed in doing this work. And then you've got the other sectors there that are working on their scenario analysis. And some of them are in more advanced stages than others. But the aim is that they will agree on one group of scenario analysis for their sector, and then the different companies will take that away and figure out what that means for their business. So they're not all trying to reinvent the wheel themselves. So again, it's just a suggestion for the XRB, and it's not something that we can require. You'll see the energy companies are kind of down the bottom there. They're not so much involved in this, and that's, I think, because they have their own in-house experts and have been doing this for quite a long time. You know, they've had people looking at hydrology risks, and it's just part and parcel of their business. So I don't think they see the need to come together in quite the same way as some of the other sectors, but I might be wrong. So. I should have put in here some examples like Meridian, and because the financial institutions gets a little bit tricky, but I would encourage you to look at Meridian's report. They do a TCFD report, and they have some good analysis in there and financial impact analysis of different scenarios. I've got a couple of examples of financial institutions here where they've run scenarios and looked at what they think the impact will be on the pricing of their portfolios. So you'll see that in the energy index, and again, this is my presumption because I don't know what sits behind this, but in the hothouse world, the energy companies haven't gone down as much as the others, and that'll be because they'll be on business as usual for quite a long time before we fall off the edge of the cliff, is my guess in terms of that. So I suppose what these illustrate is that investment companies are doing this already, right? They are actually looking at their portfolios, and they're looking at different views of the future world and thinking, oh, what might this do to our portfolios? So it's already happening. We're not asking for something that is impossible to do because people are already doing it. And then the final part of the disclosure requirement is the transition plan. So this is all very well having goals and targets, but just tell us how you're actually going to do it. Tell us how you're going to get from here to there. How are you going to use this information? How are you going to change your business And this is it's part of the greenwashing, kind of accusation where people say, oh, you've got a net zero target. Who cares, right? What are you actually doing, right, to get to that target? So again, we've got sorry, that's a bit busy, but there are some sort of quite good examples, and these are financial institutions, again, about what they're doing to decarbonise their portfolio over time. So they're looking at a 25% cut in the carbon intensity of their investments by 25, and a 60% cut in the carbon intensity of their investments by 2030. And Mercer's actually been quite good at this as well. I'll just flick through these because the slides are quite busy, but it's another good one to have a look at. So risk management. So this is so that's the strategy section. How are we doing for time? I'm just gonna. Okay. That's quite a big section. So any risk management I'll cover briefly, and then we'll get onto the metrics, which includes greenhouse gas emissions. So is there any questions on the strategy disclosures?
Do you see a tension there with, do you see a tension there? Companies, they're going to want to keep their competitive advantages, right? And you mentioned that with the energy sector, do you think they're not going to tell you not really going to tell you kind of thing?
Yeah, there has been a bit of, funnily enough, there's not been as much pushback as we thought on commercial information. And it can be at a high, if you think about what people put in their CEO and their chair's reports and annual reports, there's quite a lot of strategic information in that. What we think is that the level at which we're asking for this information will not be enough level of detail to give away commercial advantage. Because it will be, look at it as there's a balance. You're right, there will be a tension. There will be a tension there.
A couple of questions. One a little bit technical, but when you're reporting the financial impacts, is that the financial impacts of the climate risk happening, or of the cost of transitioning, or both?
Both. So, there's two. So there's the current financial impact. So that's what's already happened. And so, we are, I suppose we're asking people to use their judgment about figuring that out. So if you look at, you should be able to go, if you've described the impacts that it's had on you, and then you will then use those impacts to think about the financial. So one kind of follows the other in terms of the current impacts. So if you said, the current impacts are these things, then you need to think about, did any of those things have a financial impact? You shouldn't then be talking about financial impacts that you haven't already listed. So there should be a kind of natural link and flow on that.
Of all of that.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, thanks. And then I had a second question. Just with the scenario analysis, I would have thought there would have been some element, it's a lot of work for a company to create those scenarios and so much variability. I thought there would be some level of standardization that could occur.
Yeah, and that has been a topic that we've grappled with, and there are pros and cons. So one is, who and what, so there are global scenario, that are set out there. They're actually quite difficult to translate down to a New Zealand context. So then you think, okay, who in New Zealand is going to do the New Zealand specific one? And it's almost like we've just got to get on and do it. And so if you kind of wait to get, if it's a government agency or whoever it is, it's been hard enough to actually get some of the data. NIWA's only just starting to release information that people can use to develop their scenario analysis at enough level of granularity that it's meaningful. It's that balance between having it too high level that it's not useful at a country level, because if you think about the information that agriculture might need versus building and everything else, and then just trying to get it at a point where it's useful enough for the companies to use. So we understand because yes, we may get differences But that's why we're asking for transparency. Yeah.
Hi. So you're obviously hanging out with all the big cheeses at the big hitting end of town. General perception, are they seeing this as compliance and regulation, or are they seeing this as like, this is really good, we want to do this, and we're glad that you're here to help us do this?
Look, I think the investors are asking for it anyway, right? And so in some ways this actually helps. I've got different hats that I wear in this scenario because I'm on a board of organisation that's trying to comply and then writing the standard. But I have to say the investor community has been really loud and vocal in asking for this information anyway, right? So actually having a framework where you and all of your competitors are going to be reporting under the same framework is helpful. And look, some of the fund managers are kind of, I think globally it's done at the asset manager level, whereas this regime is asking for it at the individual fund level. And I think that's come as, that's how the legislation is written. We can impact that. And so that is quite a change for them in terms of using their global resources, because the global resources are used to doing it at a different level. So that's harder for them and will potentially have more cost associated it for them. Look, my personal experience is that the companies that I'm involved with are learning that they're going to have to deal with this anyway. They're going to have to deal with the regulation that's coming. They're going to have to deal with the customer demands. And so you're going to have to do all of that work and think about how that's going to impact your strategy. And so the disclosure regime on top is, yes, there's time and effort involved in it, but that's actually not the most important thing. The most important thing is the thinking. Not every company will think that. But we've had really good feedback all the way. If you read the submissions on the XRB website, everybody, well, not everybody, the majority have said that they've really appreciated the engagement and the willingness to take on board suggestions. Okay. So the risk management section is a bit technical. It really just sort of, it asks for companies to tell us how you did your risk assessment, tell us the methodology, tell us how you think about risks and climate risks in relation to your other risks. There's a lot of guidance on this in the TCFD that if you're really wanted to, you could read. And it's actually because climate risk assessments are actually quite different to the type of risk work that companies might be used to doing. Different time frames, interrelated things, risks that translate into social changes that then will come back and affect behaviour, transport modes, things like you're thinking over longer time frames and you're thinking much more broadly. So there are differences in how a company needs to approach the risk assessment for climate risk. So I will just in the interest of time. So measurement. So the standard asks for particular metrics to be disclosed. And the key one is the greenhouse gas emissions. I'll just get back to that. So we're asking for the total greenhouse gas emissions to be disclosed. And this is before any removals or offsets. So we want the gross, right? You can tell us about the net as well if you want and everything else, but we want the gross. And also Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. And this is a bit of a change. A lot of companies have been measuring Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions for a long time, and some Scope 3 emissions. Now, I'm going to assume that you all know what these are. We're asking for full value chain Scope 3 emissions in the second year. We're going to give a 1-year exemption, and there's been a lot of support for that in the submissions that we've had. Now, we've had organisations say this is going to be difficult. And I know, for property companies, getting emissions data from tenants, if your buildings aren't metered in that way, is difficult because you're relying on them. It's quite manual. So there are some barriers to overcome around systems. I'll come back. There are a whole bunch of other quite tricky Scope 3 emissions, things like the use of sold products. So if you're Fisher & Paykel and you're selling washing machines, we're asking you to measure and report the estimated emissions from the use of that washing machine over its life and disposal, right? So this is quite challenging. And Scope 3 emissions for investment companies, banks, include what's called Category 15 Scope 3 emissions, which is the emissions that they are financing through their lending and through their investing. But again, many companies, not all of them, many companies are already doing this, so we're not asking for the impossible. It is already being done. There is a whole standard on how to measure financed emissions called PCAF. It's part of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. I'm not going to go into that today, but there are standards and methodologies for measuring financed emissions. They're certainly in development, but they do exist. And this is why they're important, because the financed emissions are over 700 times larger for these organisations than their Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. So we got that message really loud and clear when we started out our consultation process, that people need to be thinking about their impact all the way through their business and measuring the emissions associated with that. So we're coming to the end, but the greenhouse gas information also has to be audited. That's the only part that mandatory assurance is required. So it's going to be limited assurance rather than reasonable, but that's going to be a requirement as well. I think it's from the second year, the audit timeframe. I think I might have it on a later slide, but that's so you've got some comfort over that the emissions information is being fairly stated. So it's likely to be a combination of organisations like Toitu and the Big Four plus some other providers. There's going to be an accreditation regime. MB is looking after the accreditation regime, and they're going to be consulting on that shortly. The XRB is writing the standard for the auditors to apply. We're asking for a GHG intensity emission metric. This is an example. I mean, for another company, like for a property company, a GHG emissions intensity metric is going to be emissions per metre squared, for example, or other companies might be GHG emissions per unit sold or whatever. But for finance companies, they're measuring their emissions intensity in their portfolio. That's an example of a BlackRock emissions intensity calculation. So there's a few more categories. We're asking for things like what's your exposure to physical risk? So the percentage of your property that might be exposed to physical risk. Metrics like how much money have you actually invested into mitigating climate risk? So what is your capital outlay been, for example, specifically around climate risk? And we have had some feedback on these, and people saying, "Can you just define these a little bit more clearly?" But it might, and some of these might not be applicable for some organisations either. So they might just need to say, "Well, this isn't relevant to us." And then we're asking for targets as well. And we do want to know whether or not the targets are aligned with science. So are they science-based targets, for example? We're just tweaking the wording of that in the standard at the moment. It's just assurance. Oh, here we go. Reporting periods that end after October 2024. So it will be in most people's second, not all, but most people's second report. So the first time they're reporting Scope 3, they'll have to be assured. So that's going to be quite a lot of work. And we do have quite a lot of staff guidance, so we realise this is a lot. And the staff have produced staff guidance, which that's the guidance for all sectors. We've got guidance on scenario analysis, guidance on getting started measuring greenhouse gas emissions. So there's a whole bunch of tools, and these are working drafts. We're still getting feedback and developing these as we go. So. Yes, so we've got the guidance for all sectors and the guidance for MIS managers in draft, and then more guidance that we'll be working on next year. So at the moment, we're just flat out trying to get the standard finished by the December due date, and then we'll be getting back onto the guidance again next year. I won't spend too much time on CS3, but as I said, that's just said at the beginning, that's more just about the general principles. So look, it's a lot of work. I know there's a lot of teams and a lot of companies who are working really hard. You'll see a number of companies have already started to disclose some of this. One of the things about the regime is that it is a tell us what you're doing regime, as opposed to setting the standard around this is how you should do it. You know, the scenario analysis, we've sort of strayed into that a little bit because we're saying tell us about your 3 scenarios. But, you know, the regime was kind of originally sold as a comply or explain, you know, sort of regime, but it's not. It's quite difficult to do that in a mandatory regime. You know, you can't have something that is required by law and then say, oh, but, you know, you don't have to, you know. So we've got a couple of little bits in there about the financial impacts. It's in, you know, you really, if you can't do it, tell us why. But the rest of it, things like the governance section, you know, or metrics where it says disclose the metrics you use for, or how you link your senior exec REM to your climate performance. If you don't, then you just need to say you don't. The standard doesn't say you must have this. It just says tell us about it. You know, so there's a few nuances there that people haven't quite got their head around, but. Yeah, we'll have a post-implementation review of the standard in a couple of years' time, and see how it's getting on and see what changes we need to make. Any other questions?
I'll start with one. Question around Scope 3.
Yep.
So. Am I right in assuming that if I work for a company that's feeding into one of these bigger companies, I'll be asking for my input, like my carbon? Because if I'm providing them a service or a product to do that Scope 3, is that how it's going to scope down in terms of a lot more, basically, people around or companies will have to do it because they'll have to feed into these reporters?
Yeah, it sort of depends on what industry you're in.
Yeah.
So if you are, say, doing a construction project,
yep.
Then I might be asking you, if you're doing the building, can you please tell me, like, it might not be the emissions, but it might be, I need to know the exact tons of, I need the QS stuff on the materials, right? What's the tons of cement? What's the this? So then I can calculate it. So people will do it in different ways. Okay. So they won't necessarily want to know, yeah, it depends on your relationship with that company, what information they'll ask for. And contracts are starting to be written that will require people to provide greenhouse gas information, or requiring tenants to provide their electricity information. So yes, it will have a trickle-down effect, but I think it will be different in different circumstances as to what that might look like. Banks may require the whole lot, irrespective of whether you're in the regime or out of the regime, to be honest, because the banks might need that information to calculate their financed emissions.
And that's a good play, right? That's how that scope, when everyone's talking about is it going to go down, or actually be everyone feeding up into their reporting, will automatically make a lot more people think about it and calculate it.
Yes, although at the moment It's trickling down from the banks. The banks are more interested in Scope 1 and 2, although that is starting to, that PCAF standard that I talked about requires Scope 3 further down the chain, only for certain industries at the moment, but that will expand a bit further. So you get layers upon layers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Jackie, I can see some small problems with compliance in this area. Are there sufficient resources for companies to actually make these plans at the moment in terms of getting audits of what they're doing? And will XRB have enough expertise on board when all this stuff starts coming in to actually say, hey, you're not quite doing this right, or you're minimising it? And because companies will try and do this to make their balance sheets look better for future investments. So you can see there's going to be some games played by certain companies along the way. And how will it be picked up? And have we got the expertise to do it?
Yeah, there's a resourcing and an expertise question in here. The scenario analysis piece is the one where you may find that companies will just have to make do, in the earlier years with less than perfect, it's not going to be perfect, less than optimal information, and they will just do what they can. They just need to disclose, what it is that they have done. And that they've actually done their best. Like, it probably wouldn't be acceptable to investors if you said, oh, well, we just didn't do any scenario analysis and we don't know what the future impacts are going to be. Like, that's probably not going to be acceptable. But you're right, putting in some effort, and it will get better. We are anticipating that it will get better over time as people have more time. I think because of the level that it's pitched at in terms of the companies, a lot of them are already quite far on the journey. Some are laggards, that's always true, and they're just going to have to catch up. There's only, I think there's something like 170 organisations in the room. It's not a lot. The assurance practitioner side will be tricky for the audits in terms of getting all of those audits done, not having enough assurance practitioners. And the XRB is working quite hard with the other, so there's the traditional, accounting auditors, and then you've got people like Toitu, who do audits of greenhouse gas information and have been doing for a long time. So we're trying to be as inclusive as we can in terms of how we write the assurance standards. Separately, MB is writing an accreditation regime. So we don't decide who gets to do these audits. There's a separate accreditation regime that MB is dealing with. So yes, I suppose the short answer to your question is yes, it's going to be difficult. The enforcer of the regime is the FMA. It's not the XRB. So once the reports start to be lodged, it's the FMA that's going to be doing the review of that information and deciding how it's going to approach enforcement. They have come out with some encouraging messages that it's going to be an education approach for a few years before they start to use the big stick. So as a director, I hope that's true.
Just in case we were all worried if there wasn't enough work, earlier this week we had a really interesting session with Kate Meyer from the Planetary Accounting Network. I was wondering what murmurings or what discussions had happened around kind of broadening the conversation beyond just climate and carbon. Some of the things on that were, biodiversity, ozone, phosphates, a bunch of other kind of planetary environmental limits and boundaries that could also pose risk to companies.
Yeah, look, I know, I think coming up at COP next month, there's a whole bunch of organisations who are trying to put the task force for nature-related disclosures on the agenda in a similar way that this is in terms of disclosure. So that's on the, I think that's on the agenda for COP, or some of these companies want to put it on the agenda for COP. So that these are definitely, well, as in the EU, has moved much more into this sort of broader ESG space from a mandatory reporting perspective. I mean, companies have been doing it voluntarily for quite a long time under the GRI, but to different levels of detail and scope, I suppose. Yeah, I mean, the XRB from a New Zealand perspective is doing this work in the Māori sector. It's very much a pilot, and we're going to see where that takes us around what this sort of reporting might look like in New Zealand. It sits with MB and the policymakers in terms of what's going to be mandatory rather than voluntary. Yeah.
Last question.
Hi, great presentation, thanks.
Thank you.
Just a quick question. Is anyone in New Zealand doing life cycle analyses or similar to that rigor?
Look, yes, I think some of the carbon zero related product certification are based on life cycle analysis. I haven't been involved with that for a long time. I did a little bit in the wine industry a while ago. And some of those scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions, I saw an example, I think it was a Fisher & Paykel example of emissions inventory report and audit that they had done that included that life cycle, the use of sold products. I suppose that's the downstream rather than the upstream effect. But that scope 3 life value chain is requiring literally the full life cycle analysis. But access to data and the quality of the data is challenging in terms of, is it the original data or is it proxies? Are you using estimates based on volumes or, that type of thing? So those things will always be a challenge. I think if it's a life cycle analysis from a product certification perspective, that's always quite focused because there's a label, attached to it. This is different because it's at the company sort of inventory perspective, so it's a slightly different perspective. It is done.
Brilliant, we'll leave it there. So thank you so much. We are obviously super lucky to have such an expert here to answer all those questions and very in-depth. So can we please have a round of applause for Jackie?
Thank you.
And just before you go, we've still got a few days left of Well Summit. So please carry on. We're obviously talking food security tonight, tomorrow. If we're hopefully the weather plays ball and we can get outside, and there's the community bike tour, which is fantastic. It really fills the battery a little bit because you can actually see what all the good things are happening around town. So please enjoy the next few days, and thanks for coming. Bye.